Bergman.
Thank you, Paul. Why are we bothering with all this? Now, I give this talk because most of us have some German in our background, somewhere, by marriage or we encounter it. So many people in this country are part of it. During the past 3 centuries, over 7 million Germans, Deutsche, left the area defined as the 1871 German Empire and made their way for the area defined now as the United States. So there are plenty of us over here. In 1990, now that's only 14 years ago, the U.S. Census, I didn't remember this, but I have discovered it. Move that out of the way so everybody can see this. Just slide it around. There was apparently a place on that census for us to jot down if we had German ancestors or somebody that... In 1990, the U.S. Federal Census showed that there were 58 million people considering themselves as German or part German. That's 1/4 of our population. So you can see why a talk on German genealogy strikes so much interest. The list: German, 58 million, Irish, 39, English, 33, Afro-American, 24 million, and so on, further down the list. Well, that's just to indicate to you the generic interest in German genealogy. Now, what we're going to talk about tonight is of use to anyone. I don't care if your background is Portuguese, Italian, whatever it is. Much of what we're going to talk about is not confined to German. It's a process that is applicable to whatever part of the world you're looking into. And so I hope some of you are probably way ahead of me in some areas. And so if 1 or 2 of the things we talk about tonight sticks with you, we've done our job. Now it helps to know about when I talk about grandpa, I'm talking about grandma. And I'm referring to grandpa as your first German ancestor in this country. It could be your great, or even your great-great-grandpa, but that's the grandpa we're talking about, the fella who came over here and settled in this country for the first time. Most of us have just had a wonderful time going through the censuses and building up our family background, all in the States, and we know that they arrived somewhere in Pennsylvania or someplace, and we have a great time on the internet. But we're now at the stage, many of us, where we want to reach back across the ocean and find a little bit more about the deeper background of those people who came over. And we want to find out where the first fellow to arrive over here, where he came from, so we can do our research over there. Most of us have maybe 5 or 6 through our branch from over there. You can tell a lot about Grandpa by when he came over, and most of us have already narrowed it down within the decade. These are generalizations, but it can help you very much in your research. The early groups, 1607 to 1710, came from the Palatinate, or the southwest part of Germany. And that's the area that is drained by the Rhine River. And they went down the Rhine. That was the highway. And it took them to Rotterdam. And most of them came to this country from the Rotterdam port. Many of them stayed there for years and worked to get their passage. Many indentured themselves. And this is an interesting fact. Many of them then got their passage paid by planters in this country. And then they had to work for them for 5 or 10 years. They weren't slaves, they were indentured workers. And those indenture documents are still available in this country if you know where to go and where to look. So there's some places in this country, if your people came over in 1607 to 1710, Most of them came over for religious reasons. This was not true of the folks who followed later, but they came over they were from southwest Germany, went down the Rhine, came over from Rotterdam. Most of these people got off the boat in Philadelphia or Baltimore. Most of them live in Maryland or Pennsylvania. The next group, 1710 to 1815, these people, there weren't as many of them, and they didn't come for religious reasons as much. They came from the Rhine Valley. They went down the Rhine Valley to Amsterdam and Rotterdam, and the British brought them over. The British had a lock on transportation, ocean transportation at the time, and so they came over on British ships. And as I said before, some of them were indentured. They arrived in the eastern ports, Pennsylvania, Maryland. My wife, her maiden name is Utz, U-T-Z, and those folks came over from the Palatine back and landed in Maryland, and are thick as fleas all over Maryland and Pennsylvania. Now, if that happened to you, you're lucky, because those records are manifold. People have been researching those families for years and years and years, and the libraries are full of wonderful material. The next group, 1815 to 1860, that's when the bulk of them started coming over here. I'll show you a chart in a minute, but I'll show you the bulge in the 1840s and 50s of them coming over here. These folks landed, most of them, in New York, and they took transportation, which by that time all the wonderful land in Pennsylvania was gone, even in Ohio. So they came to western Ohio, Indiana, Wisconsin, Michigan, those places, Illinois, and he said, by golly, he's right, that's where Grandpa first settled. I remember he came over and so on. Those that came over in the 1830s were called Dreißiger, for 30. And these were, strangely enough, were a better educated bunch. They also called them Lateinische, which means that they knew a little Latin because they had a good grammar school education and learned a little Latin. They were not farmers. They had a terrible time in this country. And if your folks came over in the 30s, you'll find that they moved 4 or 5 times trying to find some way to make a living. And they wound up in Cincinnati and St. Louis, large towns where they didn't have to farm because they were lousy farmers. Then from 1861 on, why they came over in the thousands, a lot of them from what we would call Eastern Germany, Poland, Russia. These were Germans that had gone to Russia. Catherine the Great had invited them up there and given them land a couple of hundred years ago because she needed good farmers to operate in that area. And they learned how to raise durum wheat. And that's a wheat that the American farmer didn't know how to raise. And these people came over then at the time of the Russian ascendancy and really drove them out, and they came to this country, and they went to Nebraska and Kansas and places, the wheat belt of our country, some of them in Canada, and they raised durum wheat because that's what they knew what to do, and they prospered in this country. Then from 1900 on, they came from all different parts of Germany. Most of these people, there was another group that came over in the mid-1800s. It was an educated class. They call them the 49ers. Now, if any of you know these people, if your family came over 49, 50, 51, these were the folks that were trying to establish a unified Germany and were frustrated by it. These were students, socialists for a while. Now, German socialists were socialists when socialism wasn't a bad word. They were highly educated, Their philosophy was well thought out. And much of what you and I enjoy today was inculcated or promoted by journalism, by journalists from that group in this country. So now we can find Grandpa by approximately the area he came from, or where we should look in this country for him, based on when he came over. This will give you an idea of the wave of immigration that came to this country. You'll notice that right along there, after the Dreissiges in the 31 to 40, the bulk of them were coming over there from 1841 up through 1870. And chances are that's when Grandpa came over. That's the bulk of them. And most of the folks on Orlando here probably came from the Midwest, and that's where Grandpa settled when he came over at that particular time. But it gives you if you recognize that the bulk of it, and then it began to diminish as time went on. Now, when did Germany begin? Does anybody?
It wasn't unified until after World War II?
No, not actually. It was before that, but it was. I'm going to put up the date here because this should be foremost in your mind.
Isn't it 1871?
Right on target, head of the class. Absolutely. Remember this date, 1871. There was no Germany before that. Now you're going to look in the old records for Grandpa, the 1850, 1860 census, and what does it say? Where does it say he came from? Prussia. Prussia. That's like saying he came from somewhere east of the Mississippi. That doesn't help you at all, because Prussia at that time was the dominant power in Europe, and they were in conflict with the French, the post-Napoleonic French, for domination of Europe. And the French thought that their eastern boundary was the Rhine River, and they were constantly trying to get over there. And the Great Franco-Prussian War finally settled the conflict. And the Germans, the Prussian army, won. And for the first time, there was a central Germany. There was a German government. Before that time, what was there? Well, there were over 300 bishoprics and duchies and principalities scattered all over. And each had its own stamps, had its own military, had its own government, had its own printing, and you can imagine how this stultified commerce. And a lot of your grandfathers came over because they couldn't make a living. There was, if you didn't know how to make shoes or something of that way, you were of no value. And the Germany as we know it today didn't begin until 1871. Now it's important to know about these little duchies. One of my forebears came from the Dukedom of Sponheim. Now you say, well, all you got to do is find the Dukedom of Sponheim and you're all set. It wasn't, his dukedom wasn't even contiguous land-wise. There's a few acres over here and a couple of hundred acres over here, and way down south is some more. And why it's so interesting is because some of them from this bunch down here, they were all Protestants. Everybody else between these little islands of the Sponheim dukedom were Roman Catholics. So you find a guy from this dukedom, from this part of the Sponheim dukedom, marrying a girl from another part of the dukedom 80 miles away. because they were brought together by the fact that they were serving the same duke. This is Germany before World War I and after World War I. This shows where everything was chopped up and sent away. Now you say Bavaria, Württemberg, Thuringen, Saxony. We were talking a moment ago about Paul's great uncle, and he said it was in Landsberg am Weser? Barta. And I said, that's Poland. And he said, you're right, it's Poland, because they had to give that up. They got it back during the war, World War II, but then they had to give it back up again. So you're going to find a lot of your ancestors come from Poland or Czechoslovakia, where there were a lot of Germans living, but they had their own church, kept their own language, and if you can find the records of that church, you got it back. Now let's generalize about Grandpa. Some of it I've already told you. He departed from a small place. There were no big cities. I'll show you in a moment. In 1800, there were only 2 cities of over 100,000 people over there in what we now know of as the Germanic lands. 100,000 people is nothing. That's less than half the size of Greater Orlando. It's the size of Clearwater. There were only 2. One of them was Hamburg and the other was Berlin. So all the rest are small places, little places. So Grandpa came from a small or a medium place. That makes it tougher, but it helps you tremendously once you find it, because it's all right there, all right? It's in one soup bowl. You don't have to go fishing all over the place. 90% of what you want is in that bowl. Here's the German cities. 1816, there were 2 of them over 100,000. By 1871, there were only 9, and probably Grandpa was over here before that. 1900, there were 33. So, he came from a small town, a little crossroads. The guy across the street from me, down in Tamarack, Hornberger is his name, the German name, and he went back about 35 years ago to the old country, and he knew the name of the town, and I said, how was it? And he says, he says, unpaved streets, pigs running around, I'm never going back there. Well, he found his little town, and a lot of them, nowadays, there are precious few pigs running around dirt streets, because the place is booming. Even the little towns have beautiful civil facilities. He came to a spot he already knew. How could he know? He just didn't plan to get off in New York and find a spot. Word was going back and forth across the pond. Took a week, several weeks for messages to go back and forth. But he had there are books that were printed for immigrants, just like guidebooks if you want to go over and see the Vatican right now, They had books printed over there in German for the potential immigrant to read. There was a whole industry. There were guys that got commissions for gathering up families and sending them over. The shipping companies would pay them a bonus. So it was the thing to do. It was, and they knew, well, that Illinois, that sounds like a pretty good place. And they knew that in Wisconsin you could buy land for 26 cents an acre. Oh, that sounded pretty good. Let's go to Wisconsin. Okay? So he came to a spot he knew. This was not a willy-nilly thing. A few willy-nilly, but we're generalizing, all right? Some of the willy-nillys got on the Erie Canal and took the Erie boat, got as far as Buffalo and said, hey, there were German people speaking in the streets and there were 8 or 10 German newspapers. He says, we're here, we're going to stay here. And they never got past Buffalo. But most of them went on.
Probably the snow.
They couldn't get out of the snow, right, yeah. Yeah, they're up there rooting for the bisons right now. Chain migration. Now this is true, I don't care which country you're tracing your people to. One brave soul came over. He wrote back, said, tell Uncle Charlie to sell the Screamin' Farm and get over here. This is paradise. So he came over, and then somebody just finished his military service and didn't know what to do with himself. So he says, by golly, and he got a letter from his nephew, come on over, we need help in the fields. This is chain migration. And you'll find not only did Grandpa come over maybe from somebody who'd gone over before, but if he was the first one, they came over after him. There's a string of them from the same family, the same town, the same church. It's a chain. And all you got to do is find a link in the chain, and you've got all sorts of fun. He didn't come alone. You say, oh yeah, my grandpa did, I found him. Well, all right, you're the exception. For the most part, they came in groups, like grapes, bunches. They came together. They had to. It was they were leaving a place for the rest of their lives. They were turning their back on something they knew, and they knew that their fathers and their grandfathers and their great-grandfathers were buried just on the other side of town. And suppose I said, tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock, we all move to the outback of Australia, and you're never going to see this place again. You say, well, will you go with me? Will you go with me? I need help. We need to pack food. We need support. We need the comfort of one another. And so he didn't come alone. Maybe he came with his family, that is his wife and children, not always. But he came with friends. He came with other members of his church. Came with other guys that he grew up with. And so you find one. Now, Paul, we were talking about this before. What was it that you mentioned to me about you found? Oh, I know what it was. You're talking about your grandmother. You don't find much about Grandma. Grandma didn't travel alone. The women didn't come over alone. Rarely. There are exceptions. I give 2 from my own family. But they knew they had been sent for. They didn't just pick up and come over. They were sent for, so that's why they traveled alone. And there would be somebody to meet them. But you don't find much about women. Women did not leave a paper trail. So you've got to find the brother, or the uncle, or the father. And that will lead you to the family, and you will then find the women. But they left there was no paper trail. Once over here, he remembered that little dukedom of Sponheim. And he was eager, he was never going back. He knew he would never go back. But he was interested in what was happening to the prince of that dukedom and his family. What was happening back there in Sponheim? So he got a hold of German newspapers. And the German newspapers did what the hotel newspaper shows me, if I want to know what's going on in Illinois yesterday, I turn to Illinois in the handout paper over at the motel. There's a German paper, and they got it broken down by these places in Germany. There's Preußen up there, Russia, and the there's Rhine, the eyes are giving out, Rhine-Provence. I don't know, this isn't focused too well, or I'm not focused too well. Oh, here's Bayern, Bavaria, Baden, Thuringia, states of Thuringia, free states. Hamburg was a free state, Gdansk, what is now Gdansk in Polish, and so on. Schlesien, Silesia, Hohenzollern, Province-Pommern, Pomerania. So this is out of his local newspaper. This is published in a little town of about 30,000 people. It's a weekly. And he could read, they would pick up the news on the wire from these places, and he could read about his own area back in the old country. He maintained his kinship. Before 1871, he was not a citizen of Germany. He was a citizen of that little place. In the way you are a citizen of the United States, you had to be impressed into that army, that duke's army, or that bishop's army. You had to be demitted from that place to cross the border, which might only be a couple of miles away. And then you had to be signed into that place. So his identity was from that place. A large part of my family comes from what is called the Hunsrück, which is on the west side of the Rhine River. And it's kind of a wild area. But they had their own language, they had their own customs, they had their own costumes, they had their own history. And when they came to this country, I can read in the German papers about them having Hunsrück parties. That's like having a neighborhood party or a New Trier high school reunion that he just came back from.
That's by Mosel, right?
Yeah, it's south of the Mosel.
Yeah.
Right, you know the area. It's beautiful.
Station at Hahn.
Ah, well, you know it like the back of your hand. It's a beautiful area to
Oh, it is a
walk in.
beautiful area.
Yeah, but it was a miserable area to try to earn a living in back in the 1800s. You can appreciate that. Okay, so he maintained this when he came over here. So you find his buddies over here, and you've got a pretty good lock on where he came from over there. Okay, 8 o'clock tomorrow, we go to West Australia. You pack one bag. That's all. You can't pack 2 bags, 3 bags. You can't ship anything. Nobody's going to ship anything over there for you. You got 1 bag. We gather at the railroad station. What are you going to take? What do you take? You take your birth certificate. You take your marriage license. You take the picture of your mother and father. You take your inoculation certificates. You take your driver's license. You take the important things with you. These are precious. These represent life in this new place. And those were preserved. Those were protected. If the house burned down, those are the first things that went out the door before the house burned down. They exist somewhere, most of them today. They are precious. This represented one's identity. And those are still somewhere in the family. They might be in an attic somewhere, but they were preserved. He brought his surname. It may have been changed a little bit, but for the most part, that surname survived. They might have dropped, if it was umlaut, you know what an umlaut is, those 2 little dots over an A or a U, and he may have dropped that. But that's about as far as he would go, because this, the person's surname is important to him. This is part of his identity. And unless he was running from the law or something, why, he wanted to hang on to it. And that's the same name as on the papers that he brought over there with him. There's a legend in this country that when people got off of the boat at Ellis Island and gave their name, that the people there didn't know what they were doing and would say, now your name is so-and-so, and they'd write it down another name. That's not true. They were talking, if you were Italian, they were talking to Italian immigration people, and they knew exactly how to spell these names. That's pure legend. He was devout. He was a church-oriented man. He and his family and his forebears, everybody had to go through that we were interrogating. The fellow would say, I'm from Genoa. And he was using a Triestino accent. You just go a few miles and it changes. When he came to this country, he spoke his German, and he thought the other German sounded a little bit funny. They clustered because of the common language. He remained interested in his Heimat, his home, as I told you before, and he joined her. He was a big joiner. He joined cultural groups, lodges, Singverein, these are singing clubs. They loved to sing, those Germans who came over to this country. They were Turnverein, these are gymnastics societies. They were big on gymnastics. And they would be sure that they belonged to a club, and they had the mats and the horse and the weights and all that fun stuff. German community theater, they didn't go to American theater, and of course there were no movies. They would go to German community theater. Now why is this important? Because when you find the newspapers that I'm going to try to lead you to, you're going to find articles in there about them participating in some of these German community projects. German veterans groups. They're in Buffalo and Cincinnati and St. Louis and Milwaukee. There were German veterans groups. I'm not talking about people of German ancestry who had served in the American Army. I'm talking about veterans of the Prussian Army or the German Army or the Bavarian Army. And they formed veterans groups. When do you suppose that ended? Yeah, World War I. 1917. Anything German was frowned upon from that point on. You couldn't belong to a German veterans group. You can imagine you'd lose your job. Some of the stuff they brought with them. These precious documents. This is an inoculation certificate. This happens to be from my grandpa, Christian Peterson. He was from Svendborg in Denmark, but the point is the same. This is 1829. Imagine that. We still got the original document from 1829. This is his smallpox vaccination. You think that was important to have with it when you came to teeming New York? Well, you bet it was. Very important. Yours is lying around somewhere. All you got to do is find it. He fought with the Danish Army back in 48, 49, and he had to be given a permit to leave Denmark. And so this is the military immigration permit that he got back in 1852 before he got on the boat. Yours is lying around somewhere. The military. Conscription was rampant all over Europe in the 1800s. We're one of the few countries that doesn't have a draft, even today. If you were born and raised in Denmark, you go into the army for 6-8 months. Jakob Freiss and his family. And it's wonderful to have the picture of them. There's my great-grandma right there. Poor thing. Had 5 children, bing, bang, bing, bang, bing, and then fell down the steps, cellar steps holding a lamp while in her nightdress and burned up. Age 24, I think it was. Poor thing. But anyway, this is the way they came over. Just before they came over, on the back, this is the important thing. If you have photographs, be sure to look for some identification of the place. And this, the photographer back in 1850 or whenever it was, says, photograph studio, fotografisches Atelier, Wilhelm Werner in Staucha, S-T-A-U-C-H-A. We can zero right in to where this picture was taken. Staucha, we know precisely where it is. And it's a little place, a very little place. Look on the back of the picture. Once in this country, knowing that they'd never see Mama or Dad again, they were dependent upon the U.S., dependent upon post. This letter is written 9 April 1904, and it says, "My dear children, Mother died." Well, you can imagine, what a horrible thing, you know. You haven't seen Mother in 20-some years, and now you get the news that she died. These are important letters. Those death letters were kept. They're in the family somewhere. Some shirt-tail relative has the death letter about Mama. And you look up there and it says, Hütten, den 18. April 1904. Okay, here's the town. That's the town Mama was living in. Chances are that's where Grandpa was before he came over here. And in the body of the, you go to the book, and there are plenty of books in the library. You go to the book, you look up this place called Hütten, and you come across 24 or 26 of them in the German territories. But down in the bottom of the letter here, it talks about going to a particular city to get flowers. Well, the city is recognizable, and that you know immediately on the map which one of the Hüttens is the one that you're looking for. And you found where Grandpa came from. This isn't much about anything, but it's interesting. The immigrants, when they came to this country, the folks in the old country figured they were rich as Croesus. Oh man, they're picking up gold off of the streets over there. And here we are suffering over here. So to communicate, they would write the letter and send it, but they wouldn't put a stamp on it. They wouldn't buy a stamp because they knew that the stupid United States would put a postage due stamp on it and collect it from their rich relative in this country. I mean, this is serious. And there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of these immigrant mail covers. And you can tell this one happens to come from Sweden, but it's addressed to, what is it? Anderson. Axel Anderson in something-burg, New York. And there's the stamp, Frewsburg, New York, on the back of the envelope. That PXXP number so-and-so, that's a postmark from a railroad train. So if you couldn't find that town, well, you could always check with the Swedish postal authorities and find out where that train ran. And you at least get the towns along that track. North America. Good old North America, where we'll all be free. The the census is generally a disappointment, because in the census, they don't give you a specific town. Here's one case where they did give it. This is in Oberndorf, the area of Oberndorf. But you look in the 1880 census, and it'd be Prussia, Oldenburg, Saxony. Well, these are these large land masses and not the name of the little town. But once in a while, somebody will put down the name of the town. They misspelled it. It's Rendsburg. There's an S in there. But you could look that dude up, and now you know the town he came from. He came from Rendsburg and Oldenburg. Grandpa finally died. The pair was married on the 12th of August, 1849 in Offenstein, Braunschweig. Zing, like a guided missile, you got their birthplace. Where they got married, chances are that they lived within a stone's throw of it. This other part that I've underlined is just pure stuff that's of interest. Mr. Illerman, who's now 76 years old, wore the same suit that he wore when he was married. Now, he couldn't even get into his uniform. Thank God the moths got mine before I could try to get into it. All right. Now, if you'll help pass these out. Yeah, we don't need that anymore. One each of those and one each of these. Unaccustomed to him.
May not be enough, but we can make more copies.
You folks may not realize it, but take it from a genealogist who's been to Salt Lake City 8 or 10 times, and up to Fort Wayne, Indiana, to the library up there, Library of Congress, been about everywhere. You have one of the best stocked libraries in the South. I don't know whether you really appreciate what they have there, but this is absolutely marvelous. The libraries are beginning to decline in attendance, genealogical attendance, because everybody's leaning on the internet. But you're missing so much. You don't know, you find a date that so-and-so got married, but who was there? Who was with them? Who witnessed the thing? What, the wedding certificate has to be signed by a couple of people. These were family members, right? If a child was baptized, you got the date that the child was born. What about that baptism? There were 3 people there, one of them holding the baby. Very important, the greatest honor in the family to be able to hold that baby. You're not going to find that on the internet. You've got to go back to the record. All right, anyway, I plugged for your library. I've tried to cross-index as much as I could in here. I put the OPL so that you know it's on the 4th floor up there. I'll just touch on a couple of them. Larry Jensen is the German expert in Salt Lake City Library. He's at the international desk there. He wrote the book. He wrote the Bible. And this man has a depth of knowledge that if you go to the Family History Center nearby and you can't answer a question, you say, I wonder if you would let me talk to Larry Jensen. And if it's a simple, a direct question rather than a rambling, would you look up my ancestry? But, what would you suggest on trying to find somebody by the name of so-and-so in such and such a place, such and such a time? Larry will tell you. Great man. Absolutely knows. And he writes in, you'll find his name in the German genealogical publications because he's constantly writing articles. There is a research outline, I should have brought mine with me, that is published by the Family History Center. Several of you are nodding your heads, you know what I'm saying. It's a pretty thick document, and it doesn't cost much, a couple of bucks, I think. And it is ideal if you want to have something to guide you through certain areas, or you say, boy, I'd like to know more. It will tell you. It will lead you. And be sure if you do buy one, get the most recent. They update it about every 2 years because things change, yes.
What did you call that again?
It's called the Research Outline for Germany. Now suppose you're interested in France or Italy. They got research outlines for those too. But the one we're talking about today is the one for Germany. Now there's on the back here, I have in that batch of 3, I have a way for you to order it online. You probably could buy one out at the Family History Center, but the danger there is that it might be one from 6 or 8 years ago, and the updated stuff isn't in there. So it's worth your buying one directly. The price is nominal. I knew Shirley Reimer. I studied with her out in Salt Lake City, and she came home and wrote that German Research Companion. And I knew she was a bright lady, but I never fully appreciated it until I got the book. It was great. Clifford Smith, another well-known name. Ernst Tode, he's, well, all of these are at the library. You ought to become acquainted with them. Let's see. Oh, Paul was asking about your uncle and the German, what was German Poland, what is now Poland. There's this item from, and they don't have it at the library, but it's Genealogical Guide to German Ancestry from East Germany and Eastern Europe, 1984. And that's, you probably get it on interlibrary loan. Or try the university, I don't know, could be. The source, some of you, if you haven't, about every few years I buy a new source. It's a big book, about yay big, costs what, 45, 50 bucks. But what a wonderful thing to have on the shelf instead of running over to the library back and forth and back and forth. But they have, I think, the best article on immigration of any that I've ever read, the source. If you just want to know more about the immigration situation, go down to the library and just copy that particular chapter, chapter 13. Now, Hansen, where's my book? I've got a couple books here. There it is. You and I aren't going to be able to afford this. The bound copies are 60 bucks a piece, and there are going to be 60 of them. So you know, there goes next week's allowance. But for 36 bucks, you can, if you've got a particular area, if you've narrowed it down to a certain area, and you have, when that one comes out, spend 36 bucks and get a paperback. All right? Why do I say that? This one happens to be on Oldenburg and Schleswig-Holstein. This is one of the first 4. They're coming out about one every 2 months until all 60 are out. If you're caught in the Rhineland like I'm going to be, there are going to be 4 of them, so I'm going to have to pop for about 150 bucks to get them, but I probably will. What he does, he breaks it down. Well, you start, you got a hint about your families. You found the place in Germany that he came from. He came from, well, let's get out of Oldenburg and Schleswig-Holstein. He came from Winbeck. Oh, I know he came from Winbeck. All right. That's, if you want the Lutheran church, oh yeah, he was Lutheranish. Or you want the Roman Catholic, the Evangelical is on 74, the Roman Catholic is on 154. Let's go to 74. All right, that gives you another index. So we want to find Winbeck, and there it is. over to a number on the map. It seems like a long way around Robinson's barn, but when you're looking to narrow down one of these 300 dookies, this is the sort of stuff you really want. And there is Christ Plain, where my folks, this particular line came from, P-L-O-N, up there. And you say, oh wow, this is great, Grand Duke. All right, he came from Salem, he got married in Salem. Christ. You look. Then you go up here to the parish P, and you look, Salem, nothing. I paid $36 and I got nothing. The problem is that up in Schleswig-Holstein, the evangelical church is so anti-Mormon that they won't let them come in and copy their records. No, a little stiff-necked, I would. So there is no film for that Salem parish. And you're good. So you say, well, I got another book that you can go to, and it'll show you where the archives are for Salem parish. You can get on an airplane and go over there. But they're so horsey they won't let you in. Really? Okay. Let's go to one where they are a little less. Let's see. All right. Here you want to go to Christ Oppenrade, and there's only, it's essentially one parish. And there is the tape number. Do you know what I'm talking about when I'm talking about family history tapes, right? Okay, it's one number. But that's the first number in the series. They didn't put them all in because there's no need, but they go from that number on. All right? So you go to your little handy-dandy computer and you put that one in, and it'll give you a printout of all of the numbers, all of the parish records from that place. And it's just, I'm going to pass this around to you. I found this is brand new, it's only a couple of months old, and I think it's one of the greatest items in the world. Now, for dealing in a very difficult place. The next one, I just complimented your library. You won't, in my estimation, there's only one other place in Florida that has this book, and that's Nova University. It's Weiner's Encyclopedic Directory of Ethnic Newspapers and Periodicals in the United States. Oh yeah, we got it. Anyway, you found that your people came from Mattoon, Illinois. You can go there and see what German newspaper was in Mattoon at the time you want it. And you can order it. If it's filmed, you can order a copy of it from the Library of Congress. I don't know.
What's the name of that book?
It's called it's Weiner, W-Y-N-E-R, Encyclopedic Directory of Ethnic Newspapers and Periodicals in the United States. And your library is one of the few in the state of Florida that has it. Well, I go on and on. Enough of me. We've well gone past our time. Some of you probably had questions. Once you fold up your meeting, I'll hang around and you can tell me. Okay? Thank you.